Yesterday, I had begun a film essay talking about a work that I had completed in the late 1980s called Displacements, and I had suggested that I may have some images of that piece to go along with further narration of it. In fact, I only have one, and that image itself is actually a Photoshop of two performance pieces that I did that includes one section of my wife, Lori, doing one of the stations in the play piece, Displacements, and the background for the performance piece that I did in Prague a number of years later. So that collage is now up on the computer screen as the background for the image that I've chosen to narrate the central piece of Displacements. Now, the image that I wanted to place here, and would have if it hadn't been lost, was an image of the performer, that's me, in jeans and a t-shirt, surrounded by a number of different kinds of tools: a saw, a hammer, a knife, and a fourth tool that I believe was a screwdriver, but I'm not entirely certain. And then there was a toolbox. And then there were blocks from a children's game, and the game was this learning type of game with the wooden blocks and then the box with the cutout shapes, so that the child learns to put the proper shape in the proper empty space and fill the box with these colored wooden blocks. This pause is imagining that child filling that box with those blocks. So we'll give him some time to complete that. Okay, so you can imagine, you can't see him learning, but you can imagine the way that he or she, performs the work. And you can also imagine that depending on the child and any other physical or mental or emotional difficulties that the child might have also become a part of the process of the child's learning. Frustration becomes a part of the process of the child's learning. Motor coordination becomes a part of the process of the child's learning. If the child is in an environment that's not suited for this particular learning process, that too becomes part of the process. In other words, if a child is cold and needs to focus on shivering or finding a blanket or asking mom to turn up the heat, that becomes part of the learning process as well. So we'll give the child a space of time to make those requests. Okay, so now you have a different image of the child performing the learning process. Okay, there he finished, or she finished, depending on who you're imagining. All right, now, let me talk a little bit about the way that I wanted to discuss this particular piece. I had promised an image, or I had suggested, perhaps, that I had an image to go along with the piece. But I found that I didn't, and so I decided that I wanted to improvise. Well, the reason that I didn't is because I lost all of my possessions around 2010, like a lot of people do in their lives, because either there's a house fire or they're forced out of work for some issue, or they lose their jobs because the economy is really bad and they have no money and they put their things in storage and um, then they can't afford the storage space and they lose all of their things or all of their things are stolen. Um, so this is a common occurrence, I suppose, and those who've had that experience will relate to the missing image perhaps in a different way than those who haven't had that experience. For those who've had that experience and trust the narration that I'm telling here, that I'm narrating here, there'll be an emotional resonance to the fact that there's a missing image. There'll be some kind of sense of, yeah, I remember losing my images. I relate in a certain way to that aspect of loss. For those who've never had that experience, it might be quite different. It might feel like a joke, or it might feel like a digression. It could feel like, it could even feel like insanity if the distance between their contextualization of experience and the experience provided is so great that they can't make the leap between that place that they are and that place that the experience narrates. And so that gap between that gap between those 2 points, that whose straight line is the vector called displacement, is not bridgeable, and that flight or that voyage from point A to point B is not comprehensible, and hence it could, just be dismissed, under any number of banners: the ludicrous, the comical, the nonsensical, the insane, the imaginary, the bizarre. Okay, so that having been said, the image that I wanted initially to replace the missing image with, that I thought I might have, because following the death of my mother, I moved into her house in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and she had a few images that I remembered from my childhood, and I had thought maybe that she had this image. It turns out that image, for whatever reason, was missing as well. So I'll describe that image. Now, what I wanted to replace the image of myself as actor in a performance piece, and let me describe it a little bit further before I describe the image that I wanted to replace it with. In this performance piece, I'm wearing jeans, I'm wearing a t-shirt, I'm on a cotton blanket as the stage. I'm surrounded by these tools: a knife, a saw, a screwdriver, and a hammer. I have this child's toy, and I'm going to use these tools to change the shapes of the blocks so that they fit easier in any number of the available placements for them. And I'm going to do it blindfolded, so I have a blindfold on. All right. Now, there was at one time an image of that taken in the actual performance of the piece, but as I said, it's gone. And then I provided a number of different types of scenarios for the way that image may have disappeared, and you can choose which one you like. The image that I wanted to replace it with was an image of me as a child around grade school age, either before kindergarten or around that time. And I'm playing in a field. It's in Oceanside, California, and I'm surrounded by chaparral and brush. and I'm barefoot and wearing a t-shirt and shorts, and I'm playing in the fields, and I have a little stick circle that I've drawn in the sand, and I'm using branches and twigs to create this kind of image of whatever you might imagine a circle represents in the sand. And I had wanted to use this because I thought it translated so well the image of me in this particular piece. In this case, the twigs in the sand, the way that the twigs had been placed in the sand were, of course, going to provide a representation of the wooden blocks. The sand itself, the soft sand that I'm sitting on, would have provided a representation of the cotton blanket. The image of the boy at 5 years old, myself, would have provided an image of me in the performance piece, the artist, at 27 or whatever I would have been at that time. The image of the tools would have been provided by my hands working very carefully on this stick circle project. But as I said, that image is gone, either because it was lost when my mother's house was robbed, following her death before I could get to Santa Fe, or because she hadn't kept a copy of it, or because it got missing along the way somehow. So unfortunately, that image no longer exists. But you can imagine it there in place of the image that I placed in the center of the screen. So translate this image of a cluster of music files into that image. And you can do that in a number of ways. You can say that the open window is the soft sand that I'm sitting on. You can say that that sidebar that represents recents, airdrops, application, documents, downloads, Lori, that's my wife's name, pictures, music, movies, desktop, iCloud, Yosemite, remote drive. You can say those are the tools. Oh, sorry, no, don't say that, because there are no tools in this image. I've already jumped to the image that this image represents. You can say that those are my hands. And then you can say that I'm represented by the music files themselves. Everything is sacred. Everything is alive. Now you know who you are. Sing about us. That's just the way it is, etc. Have I left anything out? The wooden blocks. Well, I've exhausted most of the possibilities in that image. The wooden blocks, which in the image that I want this open frame to refer to, which is the image of myself as a child, is the circle of sticks in the sand. So we'll have to space-time that one in. Imagine that the circle of sticks in the sand that I drew as a 5-year-old child are these metal baskets and large pieces of stone in the background in Prague. All right, then you have an image of the image that I wanted to substitute for the initial image. And I think that that works pretty well. All right, so let's deal with that image. Now, the reason that I'm beginning with this piece, and it really is central to Displacements, is because this is the only piece that really provided a working metaphor for the way that all of the different stations come together. And that working metaphor in the case of Displacements was this child's game, and then my reinvention of the game using these tools. And I had imagined that a number of things, that on the surface level, I am that unique one. I am that one with a set of limitations, a set of special ways of looking at the world. I am that one that doesn't quite play that game the way that it's expected, or that, or who needs a blanket to keep warm. The one who in some ways is going to be misrecognized as a failure, or as not somehow having learned the game correctly. So that's what the tools represent, right? Like that I'm changing the game because the game is difficult for me to play. So in some sense, that the actor in this piece is that child, is the child in the wheelchair that I described yesterday, is the blind one, is the one without resources, is the one that's coming up with a fantastically innovative way, in a sense, that may or may not be recognized as such, may merely be recognized as bizarre, but, to perform the task of learning this game. That's the surface level of the representation. But then, beyond the surface level of the representation, there's a sense in which I'm a kind of, caring figure, caregiver, or maternal figure that's assisting the child. And in my use of the tools and changing the nature of the game, I'm allowing the game to be changed because I recognize the limitations. And so the act of performing the task is, in a sense, modeling the behavior for the adult learning director in relationship to a child of needs, right? Introduce tools, introduce variation, introduce innovation, make the game worthy of the child. So I've basically, what I wanted people to, I mean, you can never anticipate what people are going to make of your work, but I wanted to suggest the idea that rather than thinking of the child as unworthy of the task, we should think of the task as unworthy of the child. How do we go about making unworthy games worthy of special children? How do we go about making unworthy measurement tools worthy of special children? How do we go about changing the rules of games that are unworthy to make them worthy of the sacred child? So revisiting that today and putting it in the context of American participatory democracy, and also how we view, acts of racialized violence in the United States, when we have almost daily some kind of violent crime committed upon innocent U.S. citizens, simply because we still have so much racial contextualization of our thought processes here. The police continue to kill African American citizens. We continue to have to be witness to mass shootings in the United States. We continue to be observers in this theater of terrorism that we sometimes feel helpless to engage and do something about. So what I wanted to do was, recontextualize the work that I had done in this piece so many years ago, like to frame it in such a way that it becomes part of our learning process today. and how imagining how we can create a system that's worthy of the sacredness of our own democracy and the values that we have of caring for one another, rather than imagining it as fitting people into a system and whether they're worthy of fitting into the system or not. So there were a number of ways that while I was performing this piece, people would engage me. One of the ways that people observed this piece, the audience observed this piece, was just to sit or stand silently in the background and watch me work. And that was a way of processing what I was doing, understanding the metaphors and the work of the performance, understanding the relationship of the narrating voice that I had placed inside the toolbox in a tape recorder that was narrating the events of an assault upon me, which occurred earlier that year, or perhaps a year before, in La Jolla, California. Understanding the connection between that narration and the work that I was doing in the performance piece required time and thought, and that's a perfectly reasonable way of addressing this piece, is to stand and watch and observe, and to allow the piece to become part of one's information system, and to attempt to come to terms with it, process it, understand it, make sense of it, relate it to one's own experience, either as, shared, or as different, or as analogous, or as bizarrely incomprehensible. Then there was another response, and that was to ask questions, to verbalize doubts and inabilities to understand, or attempts to process, to communicate, to put into dialogue and discourse a rationale for the performance, a reason for doing what is being done. Why are you putting the blocks into the box? What are you doing? What are you using the tools for? Am I allowed to talk to you? And then, I had options of responding. I could either choose to respond, or I could choose not to respond. I could choose to pretend that there was some kind of fifth dimensional fourth wall, if there is such a thing as that, and that I was in a space-time location that I couldn't hear the audience member asking the questions, even though that they could see me and hear me, and or I could address them directly, like I could break character, or I could stay in character. There were a number of options, and I employed a number of options in the course of that communication. I'm going to give the actor a little time now to engage with some of those questions in different ways. So you can imagine whatever question you want to ask, and then you can imagine me or a different performer if you like. You can place a different performer there responding to those questions. Okay, now I'm sure that's not enough time for those of you who have really engaging and important questions, but it's probably too much time for those of you who are bored with asking questions and want to move on to the next part of the piece. So I think a good compromise is to stop about there and narrate a little bit more. I'm going to move in a little bit. Um, uh, there was a one participant who happened to be my mother, who's now gone. But her engagement with the work was a little bit different from anyone else's. Towards the end of the piece, she actually she sort of broke the the rules that you have in museums say, like, there's a little line and you don't cross that line. Now, there was no actual line in this piece. And there certainly wasn't any sign that said, don't touch the piece, don't touch the art, don't talk to the art, don't engage the art. There were no signs like that. But the blanket, the cotton blanket, everyone seemed to recognize that the cotton blanket was a representation of a kind of border of liminality that one didn't cross, right? That in to step on the cotton or woolen or whatever it was blanket was to enter the piece in an entirely different way than to engage it with questions of communication and discourse. That it was actually to become the art, and also not just to become the art, but to become significantly a part of the life of the art performance. And she broke that fourth wall, and she picked up some of the pieces of the and this was really beyond what I had anticipated. She picked up some of the pieces of the blocks, the colored and shaped blocks, and started organizing them in a way that made sense to her. Now, my mother is a grade school teacher, and her experience and her context as an educator very much became part of the way that she understood this piece, and the way that she imagined assisting could be assisting. So she helped me with the blindfold on sort the pieces by color, which of course I wouldn't have recognized with the blindfold on, organizing them into like patterns of color and patterns of shape as well. So her role was to assist me in sorting. Now, it had never occurred to me, because I wasn't a grade school teacher or someone involved in a process of sorting in that way, it had never occurred to me that this piece was about sorting. Now, looking back at it, I can see that it engages issues of sorting. I mean, it challenges education as a process of sorting, certainly. But it doesn't seem to be unaware that a large function of education in the United States, right, is involved in this act of sorting. Like, this one goes to college, this one goes here, this one goes there, this one's abilities limit this one to go here. What are we going to do with this one? So this sorting process that she assisted me with, like, definitely related to the piece itself in a surprising way. And I thought it was interesting in a number of ways, because it occurred to me when I was being assisted that it offered a different model of what it was to be an attendant in an event, and what would motivate a kind of participation of assistance. And obviously in her case that motivation was love, right? Like not being able to see the one suffer. So I know you can't see the color of those pieces, so I'm going to see them for you, you know? And that related to the way that I had begun the piece, the idea that I had when I started, and that the narration that I provided yesterday when I talked about the young man in the wheelchair and talking with him about those things that he wasn't able to see was very much being enacted. And I hadn't told my mother that story. So there was a kind of like synergetic energy there that I was really impressed with in that piece and felt that was really valuable at that time in understanding what I wanted to do and what I wanted to explore and what I wanted to convey, and how all of those things that I wanted to communicate could become part of our learning and could become part of looking at